On behalf of historic Cabarrus and Cabarrus County, welcome to another historic moment in the story of old Cabarrus County and her people. I'm Clarence Horton. During our long history, there have been many Cabarrus County citizens in whose work and accomplishments we take an understandable pride. Our story today is about James P. Cook, a Concord resident and newspaper editor whose life work resulted in the establishment of Stonewall Jackson Training School in Cabarrus County, and who gave a new direction to juvenile justice in the state of North Carolina. James Cook was born in Mount Pleasant in 1863. He was a lifelong Lutheran and was schooled in the old Mount Pleasant Collegiate Institute. He served as a school teacher in Cabarrus County, as superintendent of the school system here, and as a state senator from this district. Jim Cook gave more than 100% to every enterprise during his long and fruitful life. But his crowning and enduring achievement was the creation of an alternative approach to punishment for troubled juvenile offenders in the state of North Carolina. In 19th century North Carolina, as in most other southern states of that era, young boys who were convicted of crimes received the same harsh sentences and punishments as adult offenders. They were either sent to the county jail or to the chain gang or to the state's prison, for there was nowhere else to send them. In 1890, Jim Cook, then a resident of Concord and the founding editor of the local daily newspaper, The Standard, witnessed a sentence of 3 years and 6 months at hard labor on the Cabarrus County chain gang, handed out to a 13-year-old boy convicted of stealing. By Mr. Cook's account, the theft amounted to $1.30. Distressed at the sight of the lad taken from the courtroom, chained to a hardened adult criminal, Mr. Cook devoted the next 17 years to a campaign for the establishment of a training school for boys. He then spent the rest of his life working to ensure the success of that school. Mr. Cook worked hard through his newspaper, The Standard, and obtained clemency for the boy from the governor, and he began to try to accumulate support for his idea of a juvenile reformatory. He obtained the support of ministers and other persons and put out a special edition of The Standard in which he published articles written by reformers. He was given support by his colleagues in the newspaper business, and favorable articles were published in the Monroe Inquirer, the Asheville Citizen, and the Raleigh News and Observer. The idea of a training school for young boys was a radical idea at the beginning of the 20th century, and supporters found the going very hard in a conservative legislature. They turned for help to the King's Daughters in North Carolina, a Christian service organization which was organized in 1886 in New York. In that same year, a chapter was formed in Wilmington, North Carolina, and then the work spread throughout North Carolina. By 1902, there were 26 local circles of the Daughters in North Carolina, all of whom were engaged in charitable work on a local level. When they met in conference that year in Raleigh in 1902, the president, Margaret Burgwyn, suggested to the Daughters meeting in conference that they adopt a project of some statewide significance. The ladies had read articles in the local newspapers telling the sad story of two very young boys who were committed to the state prison upon being convicted of crime, and they decided to make their project the establishment of a reformatory for the state of North Carolina. The Daughters worked hard and were able to gain the support of Governor Aycock and other elected officials in North Carolina. But the 1903 General Assembly was only able to offer a charter for a school without any financial assistance. The legislature pleaded that there were not enough funds available to support such an enterprise, but frankly, some of the legislators were afraid that they would be seen as being soft on crime, while others felt that it was not the job of the state to support young offenders and to house them. In 1907, however, a determined lobbying effort by the King's Daughters and their other affiliated women's groups was more successful. They presented to the legislature a petition which was said to be long enough to stretch entirely around the hall of the House of Representatives twice. They also had the support of key legislators. Local Representative M.B. Stickley of Cabarrus County and Senator W.R. Odell helped guide the legislation through the General Assembly. There was still determined opposition from a conservative core of legislators, however, and the fate of the enterprise was in jeopardy. They were finally swayed by an eloquent speech from the wife of General R.D. Johnson of Alabama. Mrs. Johnson was a North Carolina native who had moved to Alabama with her husband following the end of the war. There she assisted in the effort to build an Alabama reformatory, and she spoke movingly of the success of that reform movement in the state of Alabama, and through her efforts and through her speech, turned the tide that day in the General Assembly. Supporters were proud to count among their number Mrs. Marianna Morrison Jackson, a native of Cabarrus County who was then living in Charlotte, North Carolina. Mrs. Jackson was the widow of Confederate General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, a hero of the Confederate Army who was killed in the battle at Chancellorsville. Many of the legislators at that time were Confederate veterans, and they were reluctant to pass up the opportunity to honor Stonewall Jackson, who was widely revered among them, and to deny the request of his widow, who was also widely revered among the people of the state. The legislation passed on March 2nd, 1907, with an initial appropriation from the state of $10,000 spread over a 2-year period. It was not only a successful effort for the cause of juvenile justice in North Carolina, it is a remarkable early effort by organized women to reach a political goal, although they did not have the vote at that time, nor were they represented by women legislators. On September 3rd, 1907, Governor R.B. Glenn appointed James P. Cook to the first Board of Trustees for Stonewall Jackson School. The other trustees soon elected him their chair, a post he held for almost 20 years. On September 30th, 1907, the citizens of Concord held a meeting with the goal of obtaining enough funds to purchase land and to have the school located within the boundaries of Cabarrus County. That fundraising effort was successful, and almost 300 acres of land was purchased in Cabarrus County, which is now part of the Concord city limits. That land lay on the edge of what geologists sometimes call the Syenite Ring Dike. Seen from the air, the dike is a 22-mile circle of stones which have been a mystery for many years. Many geologists think they're the remains of prehistoric volcanic activity. In November 1907, school trustees named Professor Walter Thompson, who was then serving as superintendent of the Concord City Schools, to become the first director of instruction for Stonewall Jackson School. Concord banker and businessman Daniel Branson Coltrane agreed to become the treasurer for the school and served in that capacity for many years. The legislation establishing Stonewall Jackson School provided that at least 3 members of the North Carolina branch of the King's Daughters would be named trustees of the school. The King's Daughters were also given the privilege of turning the first ground at the groundbreaking for that historic first building. Before there was any construction, however, the new superintendent and other interested persons visited reform schools in other states to determine the best layout for the cottages which would house the young offenders. In the spring of 1908, construction began on the first 2 cottages, each of which was designed to house 30 boys. It appeared at that time that the shortage of funds would doom the project to failure, but money was raised by the King's Daughters and by the North Carolina Federation of Women's Clubs, which that first cottage appropriately named for the King's daughters, was completed by Christmas of 1908. Unfortunately, the school's limited funds were depleted by that time. The women of Concord, led by Mrs. James P. Cook, held fundraisers and secured donations of furniture from merchants in Concord. Mrs. D.L. Balst and the Concord Study Club also donated furnishings. The Stonewall Jackson Circle donated additional furnishings to the school and gave a complete set of band instruments to the school at a later time. Mrs. John K. Patterson and the Boys Bible Club of Central Methodist Church also raised funds and made donations to help outfit that first cottage. In 1915, a lovely stone chapel was erected for the use of the students at Jackson Training School. The King's daughters erected the chapel and dedicated it in honor of Margaret Burgwyn, who had served as their president for 23 years. A few years later, a stone bridge was erected across the highway to provide a safe passage for students coming from the school to the chapel. The bridge was dedicated in honor of the North Carolina boys serving in World War I. In 1997, the chapel had fallen into disrepair and disuse after 12 years of not being used for chapel services. The chapel was extensively renovated and remodeled in that year. Members of the King's daughters were present for that ceremony. Unfortunately, the chapel has again fallen into a state of disrepair after a long period of not being used for services. First pupil arrived at the school on January 12, 1909, which was also Mr. Cook's 46th birthday. When Superintendent Thompson completed his term of service on December 1st, 1913, there were 56 boys in residence at the school. The school was then situated on 300 acres of land. Charles E. Boger of Cabarrus County succeeded Mr. Thompson, serving for 29 years. When Mr. Boger retired in 1942, there were 17 cottages, an administration building, a trades building, laundry, bakery, infirmary, dairy, textile plant, ice plant, gymnasium, and 948 acres of land. The administration building was destroyed by fire in 1922 and rebuilt through the generosity of Mrs. J.W. Cannon in memory of her textile pioneer husband, who died in December 1921. The building was thereafter known as the Cannon Memorial Building. The school gymnasium, complete with swimming pool, was built with funds from the Cone family of Greensboro and was completed in August 1938. From the beginning, school officials insisted that a quality education be given to the young men under their care. They were rightfully proud of their staff of certified teachers, their library, visual aids, and the other resources that were available to them. In addition to the more traditional academic instruction, the young men learned useful trades. Many of them worked in the barber shop or in the print shop, at the dairy, on the farm, which was owned by the school. In addition, they received good religious instruction at the nearby Rocky Ridge Methodist Church. Many of them learned discipline for the first time at Jackson School and were often seen marching in military formation to and from chapel and other meetings held on the campus. Under the supervision of James Cook and Jesse C. Fisher, students at the school published a magazine called The Uplift and learned the printing trade. Other young men learned farming by raising their own food on the school's fields. Others worked in the dairy and supervised the herd of dairy cows. Big Buck, a prize-winning Hertford bull, presided over a herd of Hertford cows which furnished all the meat needed by the school. Legislative policy has now shifted away from the incarceration of young offenders for what are called status offenses, such as truancy, undisciplined behavior. As a result, the population at Jackson Training School has now dropped to an average of 80 students from a total of 500 at the school's zenith. In addition, those who are committed to Stonewall Jackson at this time tend to be committed for much more serious crimes, for felony crimes, such as drug and weapons-related offenses. In fact, a fence has had to be built at the school to prevent those students from leaving its grounds. Traditional training and vocations has now given way to a course of pre-educational training programs. Despite the change in circumstances, Stonewall Jackson School prides itself on furnishing a beneficial placement alternative for young men convicted of crime. At this time, 3 new buildings, each of which would house 32 students, are being planned. Extensive portions of the school property are presently being offered for sale. After his death, newspapers across the state published glowing tributes to James P. Cook. They spoke of him as a visionary reformer and as a savior of young boys. As Stonewall Jackson School rapidly grew, Mr. Cook traveled extensively, raising money for new additions. At his death in 1928, there were 15 cottages at Stonewall Jackson, 9 of which had been raised entirely as a result of his own personal efforts. He traveled extensively, speaking to county commissioners on behalf of his boys and speaking eloquently on their chances of success. With all the tributes, however, I suspect that James Cook would have been most touched by the silent homage paid him by his boys at his funeral. 6 of the young men at Stonewall Jackson were chosen to act as honorary pallbearers and they followed behind his casket as it proceeded to its final resting place in Concord's Oakwood Cemetery. There, the entire 400-person student body stood silently with their heads bowed and uncovered as the casket was lowered. Many of them had tears in their eyes as they witnessed their friend, their protector, their teacher, lowered to his final resting place. Thank you for joining us for another page in the history of Old Cabarrus County. We hope to see you again real soon.